So, thank you for joining on what we know is a short week in terms of working weeks. There's not one but possibly two holidays this week, and 15th August has its own security traffic implications. But we're here with a stellar group of experts, practitioners, thinkers, doers. I'm just a professor who writes on very important issues of railways and coal, two key infrastructures from the national perspective. This is also, Anurag, if I could ask you to get a copy of the book, the report one. So, it's already launched. We don't have sort of formal launches at Brookings India, but on our website is a study. I'm a co-author. My colleague Puneet Kamboj is here. So I get to take credit for him doing a lot of work. It's the way of the world. But we've also benefited extremely from guidance, support, and just brainstorming from Mr. Vivek Sahai, who's with us. So thank you. And of course, feedback and data and just sanity checks from Mr. Bajwa, Rakesh, and others. This report, like products of Brookings India, is available online on the website. There may be one or two copies that we have, but essentially, this is sort of the printed version, but PDFs are also welcome. I'll spend maybe just 5 minutes giving very 30,000-foot overview of what the findings are, and then really open it up to some discussion on what does it mean, even if you agree or don't agree with the numbers. So the first sort of caveat with any scholarly analysis is, do you trust the numbers or do you not trust the numbers? And so to help us understand some of these issues, I'm delighted to introduce Mr. H.S. Bajwa, Director, ED Coal, sorry, not Director, ED Coal for Railways, and Mr. Vivek Sahai, who's a distinguished fellow with ORF and previously was chairman of Railway Board, and Dr. Rakesh Mohan, who's a distinguished fellow with Brookings India, but has had many hats, some of which of relevance include chairman of the National Transport Policy Development Committee, and also Deputy Governor RBI, and a distinguished economist. And thank you all for joining us across multiple domains. So we've had a study that comes out that looks at this issue of railways and coal. So I'll spend just 5 minutes sort of going over some very quick highlights, but then really wanted to throw out for some discussion of what happens towards the future. So quick standard disclaimers. These are individual products, works of the scholars. Brookings India does not have an institutional view. In this study, like all studies, it's assumption-based, so we may disagree on a lot of findings. We're only discussing coal and railways. There are other freight forms. Coal is the largest, but not the only form of freight in the railways. And passengers is not the focus of this discussion, even though a lot of the railways' effort, expenditure, cost structures especially, are based on passengers. We've done a parametric analysis of what could happen for the future. The beauty of doing a parametric analysis is no one needs to say, will the future look like X? We give a whole range of scenarios, and you can feel free to choose, will the future look like A, B, or C, and then see what the implications or outcomes are. So if you look at coal, which is a very important part of what the railways carries, it has three main components in the value chain. You've got mining, which is predominantly CIL. We're using that as an example. It's about 80-something%. You've got railways, which again is not all the transport, but is the dominant form of transport of coal. And then you have the levies, which range from the coal cess to Mineral Development Fund, royalty, all of the above. And you can see over the previous 11 years till financial year 17, how all of these have been growing. And you notice a few stark things. So this is, the total coal mined by CIL. This is not power grade coal for power sector. This is the pricing structure of average aggregate revenues of CIL. And you notice that they've grown modestly over the 11 years at about 4.5%. But in the last few years, it has been flat. Railways has grown higher, little more than inflation. In fact, the railways, the tariffs for coal about 8.5% CAGR, but much higher in the last few years, and levies have skyrocketed. So levies have grown from a very low number essentially now to about 859, 860 rupees a ton. So that's a substantial growth in charges. There's a cost to transporting coal. The longer you go, the higher the aggregate cost. So when you multiply the rupees per ton, you can convert it into rupees per kilowatt hour, which is on the basis of specific coal consumption. All India average is now down to about 0.63 kilograms per kilowatt hour. So you can see that if I'm very near, I'll be paying 13 paise per kilowatt hour. And if I'm very far, I'd be paying notionally about 1.85 rupees a kilowatt hour. This is just simple arithmetic. So if you translate that to an all India basis, the heat map sort of showing one representative power plant per state shows that the further you are, obviously you're going to pay more for transport. There's nothing rocket science or magical about that. So the issue is really past to future. The historical data from 6 to 17 sort of have passengers and freight segregated, and we find, for example, the blue lines are passenger and the orange lines are freight. This is total freight, not just coal. And the volume carried in ton kilometers, the dotted orange line, has stabilized, plateaued sort of, but yet the revenues have gone up from freight considerably. This has been because the pricing structure has gone up. And so now the question is what's going on, and more importantly, what happens out into the future. So fare to freight ratio is a measure of the rupees per passenger kilometer versus the rupees per ton kilometer. And the ratio is useful because you can compare across countries independent of GDP or purchasing power parity PPP, because it's a ratio. And the Indian fare to freight ratio, as you can see on the bottom right, is 0.24. It's very, very low compared to other countries, which are mostly 0.7 for Thailand. China is 1.2. The US is an outlier on the other end. It's almost 10, but that's because the US has very little passenger volume and traffic on their railways. So why is this? Because there is something called a coaching loss, which is under recovery of fares for passenger fares. You see that on your tickets. This is not unusual. There's subsidy to all public transport worldwide. The question becomes, how is that covered? Instead of being covered through a direct subsidy, this is predominantly covered through freight charges, which mean freight is paying higher than it would have otherwise if there weren't as much of a cross-subsidy in this mechanism. So even when you remove that cross-subsidy, the Indian fare-to-freight ratio still only rises to 0.7. So what has happened is the ton kilometers have actually not risen much for coal and even other commodities as much, but the revenues have gone up mainly because the prices, if you see for example, ton kilometers has only gone up by 3.37%, but the revenue has gone up by 11%. It's predominantly because you've got a rupees per ton kilometer that's been rising dramatically. Now, ton kilometers has two components, tons and kilometers. The kilometers have actually fallen for coal going to power plants because of one-time rationalization exercise of the government, which is a good thing. It saves money. And also because there's been a slight reduction in certain plant load factors, or PLFs. So the kilometers has actually fallen in the past few years. Now, there is this cross-subsidy we mentioned. There is no judgment made whether it's right or wrong. The question really is, how will it play out in the future? Can this sustain? And our finding is not necessarily. So coal is categorized as a class 145 good, which means that it is paying notionally 45% over a normative basis of 100. The most expensive product that railways carries is, I think, POL, petroleum, oil, and lubricants, which is charged as a class 200. You can see coal is 40%, or in this year, 2017, was 40% of the volume in ton kilometer basis and 44% of the freight revenues of railways. So not too different, but still slightly, even within freight, carrying its own weight and then some. So now what happens in the future is really what we focused on. So we chose 2030 as one of the key years to look at, also did 2022 midway. And what is happening, as we all sort of know at a notional level, there's an energy transition happening with the growth of renewable energy. Is that impacting coal? To what extent? So renewables last year were about 6.6% of gross generation from an electricity perspective. If the government of India targets are met by 2022, which is now just 4 years away, that amount of renewable energy of 175 gigawatts would translate into about 19% electricity to come from renewable energy. So that's a dramatic shift. Where is that shift going to come from? It's going to come not only, so your electricity growth, we're projecting maybe in the order of 6.1, 6.2%. So that means it's displacing other generation is what happens with renewables. Some of it would be displacing hydro, in the sense hydro share is anyways falling. It is not growing as much. Gas never was a major producer in India. So it's coal that is actually going to be facing a bit of the brunt of the rise of renewable, because coal was the backstop or the residual generation in India. You also have now improved efficiency of coal power plants. As we get supercritical power plants, you don't need as much coal. So that's a good thing from an efficiency perspective, but it impacts the volume that will be carried by Indian Railways, or even Coal India, the tonnage that's required. So the last and most important point is really, it's not just the tons required. So CIL would worry about renewables and tons, but where is it located? So if you look at the renewable energy potential in India, it is disproportionately located in southern India, western India. These are places far away from the coal mines. So the impact of this energy transition is going to be even higher on Indian Railways than it might be on Coal India per se. So we have a projection. I won't go into the details, the methodology, and the assumption. But essentially, we said what would happen if we make assumptions on the leads, on the tons, the growth rates, and all of these, and then ask if coal, not just coal, but total freight, pays the entire coaching loss, as it's called, from passengers, if that model continues. We're not saying that's the only model. What does it translate to, for example, in electricity? So I won't go into the details, but essentially, historically, your passenger fare has grown only at 4.59% over those 11 years. Historically, your freight, not just coal, but total, has grown at about 6.6%. But just to stay whole, because of the underlying trends of cost structures, if passenger fare doesn't go better than 4.5%, your freight would need to grow not at historical rate, but at 7.4%, which is even higher than it used to grow in the past. So is that an equilibrium? More importantly, is that viable? As the cost of freight increases, it makes renewable energy more competitive in newer locations than it was before. What else? Distant plants who are coastal may go for imports. You have HVDC technology, high voltage DC, which was not available 10 years ago to carry 2,000 kilometers, a huge quantum of electricity. Now it can be done at about quarter the cost of the tariff of carrying the coal on Indian Railways, order of magnitude. So these are all disruptions that sort of bring into this fundamental issue of, can this trend continue, or may something break in between? So just taking all of these numbers in a summary, and I'll stop here. We had all the electricity in India today on the, paying 10 paise per kilowatt hour to cover the coaching loss. So this is the total coaching loss as apportioned to coal for power plants divided by the total kilowatt hours in the country. It's 10 paise. Now, if you only look at coal, that too coal carried by railways, because these are subsets. Not all power is coal, not all coal is railways. It's 21 paise per kilowatt hour is paid today, 2017, for passenger coverage. This is the all India average. So now if this is about 500, 600 or so kilometers, if I'm in Punjab, for example, if you remember that map, those dark blue areas, then I'll be paying triple this amount, roughly. So 50 to 60 paise per unit is being borne by those folks who are that far away for passengers of railways when you switch on the light or when that generator actually generates. Now, that's a substantial sum, but it's affordable at some level. The question is, will it get worse? So the projections indicate that your total grid-based electricity, in real terms, it'll increase from 10 to 27 paise in real terms. So it's almost triple. 18. Oh, sorry, 18. Sorry, yeah, top row. Sorry, yes, that was the transport cost. Sorry. It'll become 18 paise if your passenger fares only increase by 4.5%. So obviously, if you're able to raise your passenger fares, the cross-subsidy required decreases. So in real terms, it goes up from 10 to 18 paise per kilowatt hour. So there's a lot of unknowns. I mean, we won't go into these now. It's open for discussion. What happens if the energy transition is faster than this? We've just used Government of India targets of RE, which are reasonably well known for 2022. 2030 is a big unknown. Are there breakthroughs? Maybe battery technologies can have a big breakthrough, at which point renewables competes with baseload coal. That was not a scenario that's out there today in the short run. If you get a carbon tax, a true carbon tax, a meaningful carbon tax, there's all sorts of things that may impact your future projections. There's also some positives and things maybe that can help the DFCs, dedicated freight corridors. So wanted to just understand, what's going on. Thank you. And now, so Rakesh, you have of course looked at this aspect of transport for a while. I don't think there's rocket science being presented, maybe just some numbers put together in some ways. But compared to when your report had come out, a couple of things have sort of shifted a little. In that era, I don't think renewables were as focused as they are now. Second, we've had GST, for example, which has also increased the possibility of trucking, and the competition to railways from trucking, warehouses have improved. So is it now even harder than what you had written about? Because you wrote extensively, your committee had found that the overall share of railways in freight has been declining over time. How do we stem that from a cost perspective, from an environmental perspective? So just some sort of opening thoughts.
First, of course, let me congratulate you on this massive number crunching exercise. Having done these things more than once, I know how difficult it is. And also, as we ourselves said when we were doing projections in the National Transport Development Policy Committee report, which was issued in 2014 and went up 2032, we can guarantee, I said in my own report, that I can guarantee you that every forecast we're making is going to be wrong. But the forecasts are made from the best information available at any given time, and you've done the same thing, that you've tried to forecast from the best information available today, which is about 5 years after what we had done. And as you said, some of the key changes that have taken place already, one, of course, is the move towards renewables. Second, I think that what we had not foreseen at the time was the slowdown in the growth of power demand. Now, in your report, you've given some reasons for that, and I think that's an issue also to be thought about further, in that has the last 5 years been atypical in the slowdown and the growth of power demand, or is there a structural shift in some sense in the characteristics of power demand? One aspect of that, of course, is that industrial growth has slowed down in the last 5 years or so. And the question is that if industrial or manufacturing growth does increase significantly the next 10, 15, 20 years, then what would be the impact on power demand? Second, if urbanization growth takes place faster than it has in the past, which we don't know as of now, also, would one imagine that the power demand will increase at a faster rate, or at least go back to the kind of growth rate that we had observed? Because very, very broadly speaking, we had observed power demand to grow at the elasticity of power with respect to GDP was around unity, give or take whatever. Whereas you're showing a lower power demand elasticity. So I think that those are issues to be considered in particular, and those changes have already taken place that you have documented. Let me make a few other general comments. One, this study illustrates very well, and as did our study, and I should say that Mr. Sahai was as much part of that study as this, since he was the chairman railway board at the time. And on this particular aspect, the two people who were responsible for doing the coal, sort of power coal railways interaction are also present here. Daljit Singh and Anupam Khanna, they're also here. So I presume you will have more to say than I would. But let me just make, as I said, a couple of general comments. One, that railways refuses to reform. It's now, they've succeeded for almost 20 years. It's not, I mean, actually, it's impossible for me to even imagine that it is 20 years just about since I had the privilege, at the request of then Chairman Railway Board, to issue the Railways Report, Indian Railways Report. I think it was 1999 or 2000. 1999. Mr. Agarwal was Chairman Railway Board. It was at his request, and all the real work was done by railways people, because I obviously have no knowledge of the railways. So it was not something that was done by imagination. In the year 2000 or 2001, railways committed formally, I think in connection with the ADB loan, that they would reform their accounting system to corporate accounting. It is now almost 20 years. They have somehow succeeded in bamboozling each and every railways minister who has come. Governments have come and gone, but railways keeps on chugging slowly forever. And the point of that remark is that the kind of calculations on coaching loss, etc., are really all fictitious, because you do not have proper corporate accounting framework in the railways. And so these numbers, of course, within their own framework, obviously they have a basis. I'm not saying that, I don't mean fictitious in terms of something wrong being done, but the accounting system as such, it's very difficult to figure these things out. One point, Rahul, you had in the last slide was the impact of the DFCs, and I hope Mr. Bajwa might be able to shed some light on that. What will be that once the eastern and western DFCs come into operation, what will be the impacts? And the kind of things that I'm interested in, and again relevant to this, is one, that in the past, railways has really been capacity constrained, which is why you see the kind of low growth rates, both of passenger traffic as well as cargo traffic, because they just haven't had that kind of capacity expansion. The eastern and western DFCs, and if they get around to the other 4 DFCs that are on the plan, right? Total 6, right?
Total 5, 2 plus 4 are 6.
2 plus 4, 6. So 2 certainly are in action, and they will get done. Maybe another 4 will take place, let's see, over the next 15 years. And the question is, will they be real game changers, both in terms of huge increase in capacity for freight, and 2, as a consequence, if all the freight, at least on those, the corridors where the DFCs will be, that once all the freight moves from the current lines, then there's a huge possibility of increase in passenger traffic capacity as well. So the interesting questions in some sense that arise from that is, one, that given that 50% of the total freight is coal, so obviously the railways has been extremely constrained in terms of how much freight that they can take, and as a consequence, of course, it's road traffic that has been taking all the higher increase in freight that has been taking place. In other countries, a good part of freight traffic is containers. Because of this capacity constraint, except for Concourse operations, our proportion of container traffic and freight on the railways is very low indeed relative to other countries. And the point of all of that is that if this very large capacity expansion takes place in the next 15 years, and if the freight on the railways becomes more diversified and not as concentrated, A, on coal, and B, on other bulk traffic. And because the bulk traffic affects all aspects of life, that there are concerns to do with what kind of tariffs are charged on those bulk traffic. But there's the opposite side to it also, that because that bulk traffic has to go by railways just about, the demand is relatively inelastic to the fares charged, the tariff charged for freight. In that sense, on the one hand, railways are constrained by this. On the other hand, they're very comfortable because this traffic will come in any case. And as Rahul has shown, the tariffs have indeed been going up. On the passenger side, one aspect I think that in the future, which again, there's no way that you could take account of, is that if this capacity constraint get loosened, then one of the impacts could be, judging from the kind of increase that you're seeing in airline passenger traffic, that if with the DFCs coming into action on the major corridors, and if the speeds on the railways on those tracks for passenger trains goes up significantly, and it can without the bullet train, then it's possible to imagine a larger share of upper classes in terms of passenger traffic, which would mean also that you can have higher fares, average per passenger kilometer, even if there's difficulty in raising lower class fares. I would also venture to add that if that happens, then presumably the load on the lower class traffic will be lower, in the sense that you'll have better capacity. Today, what I see as a problem is you can't really raise lower class fares given the conditions in which people travel in the low classes. So it's very difficult to raise fares when the quality of service that people are getting in the lower classes, that basic second class unreserved, is as low as it is. So if the DFCs take place, passenger traffic capacity goes up, more trains can be put in motion, therefore presumably you will have in some sense less passenger load per coach, and therefore the quality of service can presumably increase, and therefore you can presumably increase the fares. Also, of course, in connection with this, that as long as GDP per capita keeps rising at something between 5 to 7% a year, the capacity to pay will also keep going up. So my point sort of is that there are some reasons to be optimistic if the railways do what they ought to do, and also corporatize themselves, which they resisted so far completely. And I would just end because my general remarks, that a move that has somehow been lauded by many concerned is the abolition of the railways budget and folding the railways into the general budget, to my mind, is a very reactionary move. And I'm amazed the Indian commentariat sort of says it's a very good idea. They were exactly the opposite that has been recommended not just by me, but almost anyone who's looked at the railway in the last 20 years. I are getting greater autonomy and not less. Now it's very difficult, even with the railways budget, given the magnitude of the railway budget volumes, it was never very easy for outside people to understand what's going on. Now it's impossible. You have no idea whatsoever what railways are spending on, what they're earning, what they're not earning, what is the returns you get at railways. Maybe that was the reason why they did it, to make it more opaque. So this is a real issue. So we don't know actually what's going on now. But maybe Mr. Bajwa can tell us.
So before I turn to you, Mr. Bajwa, just 2 points on what you said. One is you've raised a lot of uncertainty. So maybe Mr. Bajwa can share some projections or how specific things may play out. And of course, a 15-year time frame for additional lines and certain things. 15 years is long enough that in the energy world, coal can have major shifts. If, for example, storage technologies mature, then that's a very big if and an unknown. Second point on the demand, what you had said, power sector demand, we used another study which is about to come out. I don't want to steal the author's thunder, my colleagues, but we'll have a separate sort of event on discussing power sector growth and demand, specifically adding in higher industrialization, housing for all, zero load shedding, 100% electric vehicles as a bounding exercise. You cannot get better than that. Even then, you don't find such a high growth rate, partially because of the efficiency improvement. So just to steal sort of one sort of point, in 2015, lighting was in the order of 18-19% of your total load in the electricity. By 2030, that's expected to fall to just a few percent because the other stuff has grown and LEDs have made a substantial impact into your demand structure. So is it structural? Is it massive efficiency gains? I mean, these are all things that are unknown, but I do think you're not going to have a 1 GDP elasticity, even if you went for a very high manufacturing base.
So one just very brief final comment, that this study illustrates, and also what we had done, is the very close connection between overall macro growth, power demand growth, connection with coal, and transportation, that is railways. And really, this is a very highly interconnected framework. And therefore, a lot of what you want to say for to plan for the future has to be highly interconnected. And once again, the abolition of the planning capacity is not going to help any.
So, Mr. Bajwa, if you could just share a few thoughts on how you see the trends happening. I know the railways is spending a lot of effort on positive steps like safety, upgradation of facilities, passenger. These will have payback and value, but are they going to help the underlying freight sort of question, or how long will it take to materialize is, one of the questions that comes in.
Good afternoon, everyone. Let me also congratulate Rahul and his team for the very good report they have done, something which is very, very pertinent for railways. Coal being virtually the lifeline of railways. If coal is there, we are able to survive. And the scenario which has been brought out is certainly a challenge for us. I'm not sure, Rahul, what you had taken in your analysis where you say that the passenger fares grow at 4.5, the freight fares need to grow at around 7.5%. Have you taken into account the debt servicing which Indian Railways is required to now with the loans of LIC, JICA, World Bank for the capacities, which I think that has that been factored in?
So it's basically the historical.
So the capacity addition which is being done now is through debt. So earlier it was through the government grant. So to that extent, the challenge is even more. Yeah. So to that point, I think.
Glad that you brought it out.
The fact remains that infrastructure through debt is going to have a
Very, very
payback
very, very
challenges in this thing.
That rate the fare, that rate the rates, the freight rates.
So if we are, that is what we have been doing, increasing the freight rates. But that now we have reached the end of the rope,
The goose is.
Yeah, so we have killed the golden goose. So any further increase in case of power, we find that if we further increase the coal rates, it is going to change the dynamics of the power sector, with other options being available. So as a strategy, if you see in the last 2 years, we have not increased the freight rates. Coal is an exception, which as a one-time where some coal terminal surcharge was imposed and then it was subsequently subsumed. But the realization is that freight rates cannot be increased. So what we are trying to do is on two fronts. One is on the passenger front, maybe not upfront, but through various premium services. So upfront you cannot increase the the passenger fare, so you are trying to do it through the back end by launching some services. So those I think will continue. Some increase in the sleeper fares, which are the bulk of our earning, will have to take place at some point of time. In my opinion, the biggest challenge for railways is that we are not cost conscious. There's hardly any cost consciousness on Indian Railways, and especially with the merging of the budget, even that focus is now totally gone away, because now it's virtually the exchequer being, and so the expenditure side is not really being looked at. So that is a big challenge. as far as, let me just give some positives, that this particular year, though whatever scenarios we have seen, the coal demand has been very, very high. And the coal net ton kilometers in the first 4 months have grown by 25%.
Excellent.
I know it's not sustainable, sir. I know it's not sustainable. It has happened because of some port-based power capacity is not functioning because of various contractual issues. But so, you know, here comes this report which paints a very sort of a pessimistic picture, and here we are grappling with day to day where we have to carry more coal. There's so much of unmet demand, both on the domestic coal front as well as on the imported coal front. But we are, awake to this problem that the dynamics of power sector is changing, and the long lead plants are going to have a problem if they are going to get the schedules. So we actually reduced the long lead freight rates. So anything above 1300 kilometers, actually the freight rates are brought down. So, so I think railways will have to look at reducing the freight rates. Maybe with the capacity addition, we can carry more volumes. Right now, the volumes were a challenge because of the capacity constraint. As Mr. Rakesh Mohan said, that the DFCs can be a game changer, at least in certain segments. The Eastern DFC is dedicated for coal. I mean, the whole justification is based on coal.
Mr. Bajwa, sorry. The DFC's DPR that was public showed between 75% to 92% of the revenue to come from coal.
The Eastern DFC.
Eastern, yes. But now with the PLFs that we are seeing, the plant load factors of coal plants in that area, I mean, I don't want to use the term pessimistic, but in the sense, we should be prepared for plausible scenarios that may play
Actually,
out.
it's not that, it's not that black and white. It's not that easy. You know, a power plant in Punjab, right, I think carrying coal from Ib area, sir, is able to get a 80-85% PLF with whatever cost, everything. But a government sector plant is running at maybe less than 30 or 40% PLF. So wherever some efficiencies are coming from the power producer also, they are also even finding that even now that demand is there. And most of the demand this year has come from the long lead plants. Long lead plants. So if the power capacity in the power demand in the country grows at, let's say, 5 to 6%, and the power capacities don't grow by that rate, I'm sure that at least the existing plants will function at maybe around 60% or 55 to 60% PLF. New capacities certainly are not going to come in those areas. I don't think any, apart from maybe retiring some capacities and building new ones there, it is not going to happen. But the DFC has another challenge. One is that a huge capacity will be generated. And coal, as we know, maybe another 10 years, 15 years, but somewhere coal is going to go away. So we need to have some way of aggregating our cargo. Right now, whatever we have designed is for a unit load. So that is also a challenge which, as you said, containerization is the way it should be done. But the penetration rates of containers in the domestic sector is very, very low. Very, very low. There's a cost involved. So not just by road also, it is very low. It is very low. So I think the country needs to, move into that sort of a scenario where we have more containerization, cost effective. Most importantly, sir, I think government needs to realize that if railway is to be encouraged, there has to be some sort of, I know budgetary support, but in way of some taxation also. Some positive, support to railways vis-a-vis road. If it is more environmentally, better way of transporting, we need to encourage that also. So if the coal cess was, maybe part of it could have been used for building capacity on railways.
One thing I wanted to say.
Yeah.
We are building more thermal power plants, but the other was retired because it had become old, and a new power plant is being built and being added. In fact, we are going to add more thermal capacity, then we are going to add.
So that is taking place in the nearby areas, near the coal areas. It is going to take place, the capacities which are coming are going to come in the coal areas only. So the leads are going to be low. We are saying in the north and western India, there it is not really happening. In the regions around that, it is happening. But another thing which we are finding that even very long lead plants, so the commercial mining is also going to make a difference, or captive mining. So NTPC from a mine in Jharkhand is willing to carry coal to Karnataka through rail.
But their PLF is struggling in Karnataka.
No, it is not now.
This
So
year
there
has
are-
been a...
So if the country's power demand grows at, it continues to grow, and the capacities don't really, in the last 10 years, a lot of capacity has been added. I don't think the growth in the power capacity is going to be in that range now, especially with the power, the private sector having burned their fingers. So I don't think the power, at least on the coal-based side, not many capacities are going to come up. So if the cost of coal production is also less, because in a captive mining they are saying it is around 1,000 rupees per ton cheaper if we carry our coal from there than buy Singareni coal. So dynamics could change with the coal mining also there.
But the latest economist says that India will still be using, for the next 15, 20 years, 60% of power will come from coal.
So that is what is, because the word is still, not final, what is going to be the coal demand.
Without getting into details, like Rakesh said, you do the best you can with the assumptions or detail. But Power's 2022 projection, for example, used a 0.65 kilogram per kilowatt hour assumption for 2022, while already in this year, we're down to 0.63. And as supercritical and more efficient power plants come in, the tonnage will shift. It's about the trends.
0.66 would be for some specific.
No, all India average is 0.63 now, is what the ministry.
It doesn't change the qualitative
If it is
picture. It doesn't change any policy implication. So let's not debate 0.6
Sure.
whether 0.6.
No, trend lines is what we're just.
It doesn't. You
Sure.
go through it. If you do a robustness analysis, it really doesn't matter.
Sure.
So
Yeah, 1 minute, Mr. Bajwa. I am Bharat Vora from Jindal Steel and Power. In the last 8 to 10 months, we have been noting that there is a lot of pressure on diverting coal for long distance movement, as you rightly said just now. But due to that, the other industry, the steel industry, the aluminium industry, their satisfaction level of the rakes is suffering tremendously. Earlier, we used to indent for about 120 rakes in a month, and we would get about 110, 115 rakes. So satisfaction level was as high as 90%. But this has gone down to 60 to 65% in the last few months because the entire thrust is on rake movement. So we have to think of the other industry also because that's suffering. The other point I want to make is, Rahul showed in his presentation that the long distance movement of coal results in a coal price of about 1.86 per unit of electricity generated. So maybe if it is 1.86 or even if it is 1.5, it is substantially very high as compared to transmission charges. Earlier, when we set up power plants, I worked in NTPC for quite some time, and there the concept was to move the power plants from the cities to the mine heads, so that this coal transportation doesn't happen. Fine. And that has been very largely successful. But the state utilities, due to other political compulsions, they want to have the power plants still within their own states. So there is no logic now for Haryana or Punjab or for Delhi to replace a old power plant by setting up a power plant in its own territory. They would rather transmit the electricity from pit heads, and that has become substantially cheaper. People can transmit power from Orissa to Punjab in 70 paisa. That is the transmission charge today, because power grid has got surplus capacity. If somebody sees the transmission network in the load dispatch centers, you will see that the transmission lines are underutilized to the extent of 66%. They are designed for transmitting 3000 megawatts of power. They are transmitting just 1000 megawatts of power. It's such a gross underutilization of those assets which have been built up at a huge cost. So maybe we have to think of making coal transportation over long distances costlier rather than cheaper.
exactly.
So let me just make a general comment arising from the last one, which is, I think you very well illustrated what I said in a very general fashion, which is the crucial need for coordination of further planning, investment, routes, everything else, between power, coal and the railways. And the question is, do we now have any mechanism to do that? And you have to look ahead for something like 15 years. And it has to keep changing also because of all the changes. We've already seen huge change last 5 years. There'll be many more changes we are not even thinking of today, the next 10, 15 years. And we at present, we had a little bit of a capacity earlier, and now we have none at all to do this kind of coordination for the long run.
See, there are a couple of issues on freight rates and all. Yeah.
Please introduce yourself.
I'm Dr. Sharma. I've been with Planning Commission. last year we imported 210 million tons of coal. This year we have imported about 60 million tons in the first quarter. Now the issue is that if you import it from Kalimantan, Indonesia, to Mundra, Kandla, Krishnapatnam, and North Dahej, the ocean freight is $8 to $10 per ton of coal for a calorific value of 4,200 kcal per kg. Now, that works out about 600 to 700 for a distance of nautical miles at 2,700 nautical miles. We are importing majority of thermal coal from Indonesia. And these particular locations where we are importing coal from Indonesia are at a distance of about 1,500 to 2,000 kilometers from If Valley. The major coal producer this year, the production had been 183 million tons. And that's where the new production is going to come from. Now, if, yes, we can get transportation, the freight rates at 700 rupees per ton from Kalimantan to these locations, it's going to be a big threat for the railways. For a 1,500 kilometers distance, your freight rates are about 2,000 rupees per ton or so. Now, what happens is that, besides this, what also happens is that Indonesia adjusts its coal prices. Also, the barges, the charter hire rates also get adjusted with respect to the coal supplies from the Indian If Valley to these locations. Now the competition is coming in from Indonesia to these locations. And they are having a dynamic, not only the freight, but the coal prices to adjust with the Indian coal supplies from If Valley. Now, when Indonesia coal exports and ship freight, they can have a dynamic freight rates. The coal import prices, yes, Indian Railways would have to work accordingly with respect to that. Now, that's an area where Indian Railways has to learn for the coal freight rates, because the If Valley coal prices at 3,700 kcal per kg of coal price, that is about 850 rupees per ton. But at these locations, your freight rates are at 2,000 rupees per ton. So, I mean, the Indonesian coal versus the If Valley coal with 2,000 kilometers distance, that finds a better price at these locations. Yeah, so Railways has to take some analytical views as to how to increase the coal, how to really compete with the imported coal.
I think this can be replied quite well. I mean, for 20 years we have been having imported coal, and we've seen what kind of changes have taken place.
No, 20 years. 20 years these things have not happened. It's only last 5 years.
Your point is very valid. I fully endorse that. But this is also an opportunity for us as a country where we are importing substantial quantities of coal. And domestic coal is also available in huge quantities. Maybe we need, and we tried that. I mean, 15, 16, 17, when the coal demand went down, we sat with Ministry of Coal and Power, and we called our utilities, and we were able to, cajole them that don't import. We will give you good quality coal from ECL, and some of it happened also. But now we again back because again there's a coal
But have
shortage.
some dynamic freight rate system kind of thing, which you also use it for the passenger.
So what you are saying, it should be linked to the international prices. Right. Fair enough. I think if we could be so agile, nothing like that.
So Mr. Sahai had something.
No, I think let us finish with whatever. I'll speak. I'll like to sum up how it is going on.
Yeah.
Anupam can ask question.
Yeah. So first, I have one specific question which is related to passenger. What is the share of this passenger revenue that is coming from? Can you disaggregate it like suburban versus?
We have that. We didn't get into it.
No, but let me tell you, it makes a big change. We had this discussion when we are doing. Now, if I hadn't, when I you made the presentation, I'm just wondering where is the problem? Because to me, in some ways, this is a more optimistic scenario than I had anticipated. And the reason is very simple. There are 3 parts to it. Number one, Rakesh, actually if you remember, we did do some scenarios where we had growth between 5 and 6%. And let me tell you, that had a counterintuitive phenomenon. The counterintuitive was that when growth was slowing down, the coal movement was increasing. The average movement, that was a bad scenario. The good scenario to me is that actually it's come down by 30%, because we thought we needed to incentivize to come down much more. And it was immediately we said, if, for example, the linkages had been allocated optimally, it would have had an impact immediately of 10%. Subsequently, imports and a whole bunch of all the things that we thought would be in an optimal scenario would lead to these trends that you're showing. Second, I think we all agree that 50% of capacity, effectively between 45 and 50% of rail freight capacity being garnered by coal is not something that makes sense at all. If anything, we should be, weaning railways away from coal transport. And so, again, it's something good. I think in the long run, thirdly, if you, just from a policy point of view, and I think it's a good idea, for example, a social case or an economic case could be made for subsidizing passenger transport, especially because a large chunk of the passenger revenue that you will be ending up subsidizing is suburban, right? Now, where do you get that subsidy from? As an orthodox economist, it should come from the fisc. Now, there are always political economy problems, and you say, no, you should, in the end, you end up cross-subsidizing within the sector. There are lots of problems with it. But here, what you're demonstrating is that it's actually not something that is really causing a problem for the railway sector, because it's causing a problem. The money is being sourced by a wide population at large, almost as good as in fact, a larger population than is normally taxed. So this is also good. You're raising money from a large population, and you're providing a targeted subsidy. So from an heterodox, at least economic point of view, where's the problem? This is exactly what you'd go. I would argue you should give, put a higher charge on coal freight and make life simpler for the other industry. Why not? I mean, I think there's a very strong economic case for it.
So, I mean, the counter is, of course, how does it happen globally? So we can compare what your electricity prices are. So the question is, A, electricity prices, and B, how will the future not look like the past?
The electricity prices, let me just say on that, the model that we did for Rakesh's committee optimized it, showed exactly what this gentleman was saying, that we should be transmitting much more.
Yeah, HVDC.
And the only constraint was that
the grid was not
built up the transmission capacity. Secondly, no, there was another issue, which was the balancing of the grid, which would be more. I think security is today. I would say security problems are bigger with freight transport than with. So, and thirdly, even for renewables, in fact, whatever you say modeling, I've been saying for 3-4 years, the next big crisis we are having in our infrastructure sector is the bust in the renewable sector. I mean, that's where the banks are going to get hit now.
I think, Rahul, I'd like to bring back the discussion to the origin where we started. And we started at the way railway is making the freight rates. Are we subsidizing the passenger travel through coal, and in turn a person who's using electricity is actually paying for the passenger travel? Person who's traveling in passenger, you all are paying some. That is how we started. I come back to that. And Anupam, you raised a very good point. Let us understand how much railways earns from, I like to, many of you would be knowing, I'll just like to bring it into your thinking process. That the freight earnings account for about 66% of our total earnings. And about 29 to 30% is from passenger, first thing. But please understand that whatever passenger earnings are coming, if you go by the number of passengers who are traveling, there will be two groups, suburban and non-suburban. Suburban traveling mostly in Mumbai, about 54-55% of them travel in Mumbai, then Delhi, Calcutta, Madras, and certain other locations, Ahmedabad and around, we give them season tickets, even on the local trains there. So we are having suburban, non-suburban, and then in non-suburban we have second class, and we will think about non-AC class and AC class. Please understand, 3 AC, second AC, first AC, there are 3 kinds of AC classes. These are the upper classes. Then you have second class, sleeper classes where you travel reserved in second class and you have unreserved. I don't know how many of you have an idea that actually about 91% of the passengers traveling every day on the railway system are in non-AC segment. Non-AC segment. Only 9% travel in the AC segment. I don't know how many of you have traveled in non-AC segment ever in railways. If you have traveled in railways, when we are discussing this. Please understand that. But the total number, and how many passengers do we carry in a day? We carry 23 million passengers every day. 23 million. And out of that, 91% are in non-AC. That is the first indication. So where do you increase the passenger? When we are saying that passenger should not be subsidized, out of that 91%, actually half of them travel in unreserved category and half of them are in, we all that did for the NTDPC and earlier also. So now think that 45% are unreserved, 45% are reserved non-AC. So where do you increase? So now you start thinking, put your economic cap and social cap both together, who should be taxed? Who should be paying more? Now who will travel today in non-reserved, non-AC compartment? Tell me who will be that person? Who will say that I'll go unreserved in non-AC and travel 1,000 kilometers? When we come to this, who should be taxed? Then should we increase the non-AC, non-reserved? And who's traveling in compartments which can hold 80 to 100 passengers where 250 fit in? That is how the number is coming. So somebody has to take that call. I would say, why not increase? Now you will be surprised to know that for 12 years, we actually, in 12 years, twice we reduced that fare, which was wrong. This was done during the UPA one time. I have calculated that had we not reduced the fare of these people, they were paying in 2001 or 2002 rates. Whatever 2002 rates were, if they had continued till 2013 when the next increase came, Indian Railways would have made about 25,000 crore more in that period from the passenger earnings. Because it's a question of bulk base. It's a base effect which comes into play. So that is where the shoe started pinching, and probably we had kept it at that level, probably nobody wanted that reduction to come, but it came. When increase came in 2013, there was no murmur. Now I think it is increased a little. It's a political call, whether you should increase or not. We should increase the reserved non-AC, that is sleeper class. Can we increase? I think we should, what we should do, my suggestion is increase it by 3 to 4% every year. Don't do a 20% increase after 5 years in between. Do it every year, 3%, 4%. Shoe will not pinch anybody. But the moment you go for 20% increase, everybody will start crying. This is where railway is wrong, and that is where I think the political bosses are also wrong.
So the same thing could be said for the electricity sector. They should increase it a little bit every year instead of 5 years later getting a jump.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Yes.
In general, the record of absolute majorities for reforms in India is not good.
I agree with you, but I have to bring it out that this is what is happening.
I just like to make point out this very interesting thing. I read a newspaper report. Sorry.
Sir, if you could just wait till...
Just small thing. I read a newspaper report of 1914 about the railways and the same problem of overcrowding.
Then I will like to tell you something. If you read Mr. Carr's book and G.S. Khosla's book on history of Indian railways, you will find that so many committees were formed in 1868, 1878, 1903. They were discussing the same thing that we are discussing today.
Yeah. But the
the
interesting point was that they increased the fares for the lower class, but still the number of people increased.
Yes.
And there was overcrowding, they were talking in 1914.
So if you go into the 1950s rate of passenger fares of 1950s, you will find that in the value of rupee, if you compensate, you will find that they are now paying less than half of what people were affording in 1950s, 54, 56, 57. After which the thing came differently, and then we never took a decision to increase the passenger fare. But I'm again coming back to that. So how do we take that? When we are saying that passenger fares should be increased, yes, they should be, but we should take a call whether we'll increase it for non-reserved, non-AC. We may probably increase it by 1% every year. It may not pinch. We may increase the non-AC reserved by 3%. And the air-conditioned class, probably we should link it with the inflation or something. And keep in mind,
It's a backstop. There's a backstop of
you have got a upper limit of airfare. The moment it is like that in quantum mechanics, it comes that when the electrons start escaping, when that energy level comes, it escapes into another orbit. So it will go from rail to air. So you have to, lastly, we make a lot of effort, but again, it is a call of the government. Whatever we may say, it's a call of the government whether we are going to increase it or not. And if it is increased, it is the government which has to face the music. And they should have the strength to face that music. That is how it is. We know that railways are paying a price for that. There are many such reforms which are possible. The railway officers, or Mr. Bajwa, or if MT had come, Mr. Pillai and all, they all understand it very well. Lot of analysis goes on there. But somehow these things are not coming. Probably effort should be made by all of you to make the government of India understand that this is what's to be done. It is not a call of one person alone. Thank you.
Thank you. So I have just one sort of last thread I had. We've actually already jumped to a lot of the good discussion. It really relates to this future issue. How is the future not necessarily going to look like the past? I think we are underestimating the pressures of renewables because it's disproportional in certain locations. You mentioned that the coal traffic went up this year, but to now counter the economists' views, economics calculations work at the margin. We are so far away from equilibrium in this space. It's lumpy, it's sort of got lock-in and so many other characteristics. If somebody says that I want to build a coal plant here, a power plant here, and now railways is sort of figuring out how do we get a railway line to there, who's bearing that risk when you do not know what their PLF is necessarily going to look like? So one of the instruments talked of in the past was fuel supply agreements to fuel supply and transport agreements. Because right now risk was, like Rakesh, you said there's this chain of stakeholders who are interconnected, but it comes back to who's bearing that risk. If we don't know the PLFs, Karnataka today is the single largest renewables in the country. They have 12.8 GW of renewable capacity. Their demand yesterday went down to 6 GW. It's a monsoon season. And the high yesterday was somewhere, or a few days ago, 8,000-ish. And they have 12 just of renewable. So, and we're not done with the renewables revolution by any stretch. So now the question is, you've got these time frame issues. When you do your sort of freight planning, the DFC, when I hear 15 years, we'll get somewhere, I'm worried that are we sort of chasing the wrong horse, or, what, from a coal perspective, putting our head around, coal, keeping it afloat. Who's bearing the risk? What are the right instruments? Because ultimately, hopefully it's not the banks, Rakesh. I mean, hopefully this, it doesn't come back to the banks.
Can I build on that question?
Yeah.
It's part of his question. Sure. Yeah. Yep. Can you hear me? My name is Kyle Chan. I'm a PhD student at Princeton, and I'm writing my dissertation about the Indian railways and the Chinese railways. So my question related to what you had just, the point you just brought up, is about the supply side, because we were talking about these demand issues, about whether demand will come from renewables, in which case the railways might not have a strong role. But from the supply side, what would you do if you were able to suddenly have a massive infusion of investment, and where would you put it in terms of freight investment? And then what would your vision be, and how would that compare to the demands from the power producers, from the power generators, and from the coal side? And what are the causes of the gap between some of these views? So that was a whole set of questions, but basically trying to understand some of these supply side provision issues.
I think, again, you have raised a very valid point regarding the risk, which I think we have also been grappling with this issue. One could be, yes, through a fuel supply transport agreement, FSTA, which we have been listing. Once we have adequate capacities, and a lot of investments are now, lined up and have started taking place. Apart from the DFCs, most of the double lines are becoming 4 lines. Single lines are becoming double lines. Most of our, wherever coal corridors are, we have, capacity investments have been lined up. So another 2 to 3 years, we going to see a lot of capacity in terms of network expansion. In terms of wagons, on this issue of risk sharing, we have general purpose wagons for investment. So that could be one way of, sharing the risk with the private power producers. Let them buy the wagons. Right now, railway is part of the variable cost, railway freight, while your transmission costs are part of the fixed cost, because they sign an agreement and they book a capacity. So we also need to move maybe in that sort of a regime where I also book a capacity. Okay, I'll carry so much. Whether you use this capacity or you don't use this capacity, you have to pay me. So that sort of a regime we would also need to build in, especially when we are, so much of capacity augmentation is taking place. This year we made a slight progress in that advance payment by NTPC. So they paid around 5,000 crore advance. So it was just as beginning where NTPC paid us 5,000 crore as advance transportation booking, that okay, you have to carry so many rakes for me, and they paid 5,000 crore upfront in the March month itself for this. I think we'll be able to finish that in another 2-3 months time. So, we need to work towards that for sharing the risk. Certainly, otherwise, yes, it is going to be a problem. I didn't really get your question. It's basically on how we are on the supply side, on the capacity side, how we are planning.
Right. If you suddenly had all the money you wanted in the world,
actually, we have the money right now because it's to debt. Money is not an issue right now, and
what is the issue?
yeah, money is not an issue right now. The issue is more of the business model, how it will work. So money is not an issue. Investments are lined up both in the rolling stock as well as in the fixed infrastructure.
But the investments, I think his question is whether they are debottlenecking or network capacity expansion, or link the so-called risky ones that he's talking about or referring to, which are new plants or new lines. And what I remember from this model that we did, the highest return investments were really debottlenecking. And in spite of what the railways had been saying for a long time, Daljit, many of them were still pending and were on paper. And those are the ones we should be doing first. As far as new ones concerned that you are talking about, we don't need any more thermal power plants. That's the fact that we have a problem right now. But that's the problem.
Yes.
We have approved too many.
We have 50
our capacity
GW under construction. Yeah. So
They will not be financed.
capacity augmentation is taking place mostly on debottlenecking, and the last mile connectivity to the mines, not to the power plants but to the mines, because a lot of areas are coming up where you don't have rail connectivity, but which are the growth areas, Raigad, Mand, Karanpura area, Vasundhara area. So there that last mile connectivity things have come.
But that's for coal. But
Coal,
I think his
yeah.
question is for general other freight. There are a lot more.
Port connectivities are also
Port connectivity projects, they are being.
So since we're very near the end, before final remarks, I want to open it up formally now. It's been good that many of you have been interacting. We have a question in the back, and then you've been very patient, Alu. Question on how do we prioritize? Sanjeev.
Thanks, Rahul. My name is Sanjeev Aluwalia. So I also work for your organization, the Observer Research Foundation. Rahul, I just wanted to point out that I'm a little confused. This current organization. I wish I'd worked for the railways. I wouldn't be here, then I'd be lying in a saloon somewhere, having a ball. Rahul, on the pessimism about the demand for coal, where is this coming from? Because the IEA projections, right up till 2040, they say that coal demand in India, total, including for industry, etc., would be more than 50% of the total demand. And today we're at somewhere about 40% or something. So actually, it goes up. So I think that we should not be unduly pessimistic about the fact, A, that we will need thermal power, which includes other fuels apart from coal. Also coal, which is a domestic fuel. How are we suddenly going to run away from the problem that on the trade account you have a historical deficit? This is not going to go away. So the need to substitute, and have domestic production, coal ramped up, is going to push you towards coal, whatever you may do. You may go for clean coal. Germany today has gone back to coal.
Yeah.
It's a clean country.
And 5x the coal electricity per capita than India.
Yeah. So I think this pessimism, I don't know where it's coming from.
So if I could
actually, if you made the railways more efficient with containerization, etc., okay, your competitiveness in exports will go up tremendously, because the costs will come down tremendously for general cargo, which is not being done. And so balance payments won't be a problem.
So, Sanjay, if I could, I mean, like I mentioned, I don't want to steal the thunder of my colleagues' work going into the detail on the demand projections, but it's not that we're going to reduce our coal so much. It's actually the railways' impact is going to be slightly disproportional vis-a-vis Coal India, because the locations at where your power plants are, your coastal have, like you mentioned, the import parity sort of kick up, HVDC rise, and renewables are disproportionately in western and southern India, is what actually is the stress that we wrote about in this piece. It's not that we're getting away from coal by any stretch, and we can discuss those details of the projections. Certainly it's not going away.
We have done on the coal demand.
Yes, yes, separate, yeah. So your point is well taken. We're
I just wanted to reply to your summation. In fact, Indian railways are not conscious about the load factor like airlines. Now, airlines, they aspire for 80 to 90% load factor. Indian railways don't have a concept of load factor. As a matter of interest, to be very frank, I mean, I analyze almost a couple of days that these days Rajdhanis, the premium trains, they have a vacancy of about 200 to 600 seats, and that's quite a lot. And if you take an average load factor for all these premium trains, in a year, your load factor would not be more than 50 to 60%. So that's an area where one has to really look into it. And I mean,
I'll reply to it after Mr. Bajwa has replied to other things. I have an answer for this.
And then we have this dynamic fare, which goes upward. In railways, it goes up and down both.
So they attempted.
I think it's one raised by Dr. Mohan about the disappearance of the Niti Aayog and the future.
Planning Commission.
Planning Commission.
You know, I just, I don't think I didn't introduce myself. I am Sarabjit Singh. I've retired from the general manager from the railways. Mr. Rakesh Mohan and Mr. Vivek know me well. And just to take off on what Mr. Rakesh Mohan had said about the not having a reform and what are the issues which I see here, they're coming because the railways are not willing to reform. And they're not willing to reform partly because people, ultimately the political class which manages the railways, are not really understand what the working of the railways is. And therefore, there is a lack of education and awareness. And I had mentioned that earlier, maybe I'm saying it now because everyone is here, that there should be some sort of a group trying to educate and understanding on a continuous basis what needs to be done. And then all these issues we are talking about perhaps would be handled that way. Because as long as the railways remains a department of the government, a commercial organization, a department of the railway, of the government, managed by a civil service with an incentive system which says fixed remuneration and time-bound promotion, not linked with the way the railways are going to get efficiency, I don't know how things can get changed.
So it sounded like you were describing the electricity discoms for a second.
Well, I think is that Brookings is here. Why don't you think of having some sort of a think tank or something on this?
Hi. My name is Rohit. I'm from the Center for Science and Environment. The discussion has been quite interesting, and I must say that the panel has enlightened us quite a bit. There's one thing I think that was mentioned in passing that I think deserves more attention, and that has been the closure of power plants as it has started to happen now. And I think a lot of this also affects the railways because of the supply and the long lead. Now, interestingly, as you have mentioned, the Northwest India is where some of the more prominent closures are now beginning to occur.
Delhi, for example.
Delhi is one. Even in Punjab, you have had power plants which have closed with a lot of acrimonious results surrounding it politically. So, I mean, I'm sure that the railways is trying to, also acknowledge loss of customers of such bulk volumes for themselves by diversifying their load.
So in fact, since we're approaching we're past the technical time, but I know there's one hand. if any of you
Just
also
one
have
line.
final sort of remarks or thoughts as well,
No, let Bob-
then
Just
yeah.
one line. Certainly, we are sensitive to that issue, but in all these states, wherever this is happening, you will find an IPP coming up in that state and a state utility closing down. So it's not that the net capacity in that state has gone down. The IPPs have come up and the state utilities have been shut down.
But the question is, what's the PLF? Because now you get to this issue of center, state, and private sectors have measurably different PLFs across the country. So that's another.
It depends on the PPA.
Yeah. Or sometimes they don't have one. The private may not have the PPA.
I am from the technical side. My name is Sagar. I run a lot of technical companies also. You know, when you talk of two things, one is the economy of coal, the other is the efficiency of the rail. So economy of coal, when you talk of economy of coal, we can understand. But the efficiency of rail will come when your signals and your rolling stocks are going to improve. If you have economy of coal to be, you know, on the rail, which are not good pathways, they don't have a better signals, what is the efficiency you are going to get? So my question is, there has to be an overall improvement to get the rail to a speed, whether it is a passenger, it's a goods train, the efficiency has to come from your rail being the infrastructure of the rolling stock and the signals getting to the best of the possible. That is the efficiency overall. Coal efficiency, maybe 2%. Thank you, sir. Any comment?
If closing sort of thoughts. Yes, yes.
I like to mention 2-3 things. I think Rakesh had raised certain issues. One was about the closure or discontinuation of the railway budget. I can only say one sentence, that I hope, I wish, then when I was chairman of railway board, the budget was not there, because it was such a big toil effort. So we had to sit till 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock, sometimes overnight, only to prepare a budget, because when you prepare a budget and place it in the house of the parliament, you cannot have a situation where there is a privilege move against you. Please understand what is a privilege motion in the parliament. And so your data, your whatever you're speaking should be factually very correct, and your analysis should be very proper, so that in debate, the minister doesn't have to cut a sorry figure. And a lot of effort used to go into it. So they're all spared of that now.
So that's why it was valuable and useful. And now they're happy because you don't have to do it.
Government as a whole. So now it is not there. I don't think it can be brought out. I don't know how many of you know why the budget came. I'll just, can I take 2-3 minutes? When the Constitution of India was made, there was no provision for a separate budget for railways. How it came that Mr. Gopalaswamy Iyengar, who was in the cabinet, he was made in charge of a committee to decide whether there should be a separate railway budget or not. And he prescribed that, very few people know that the first budget of the independent India, the railway budget was more than the finance budget of the country. The earning and expenditure both were more than the earning and expenditure of Government of India. And it continued for 2 years when it started going up. So Gopalaswamy Iyengar was a very erudite scholar and understood the things. He said that since we are in the stage of bringing up a new India and we should know exactly what the nation economics is, we should keep them separate so that it doesn't vitiate the budget of the nation. And this is a commercial organization, they should have a separate budget. And it may continue for 5 years. I'll come back to the loss of freight and what has been told, and Mr. Bajwa has also very rightly pointed out, that we are too much dependent on coal and bulk movement. We lost a lot of traffic sometimes in 80s when we went for the block rake working. And we thought that containerization is the panacea and will bring back all the lost traffic through containerization. This didn't happen. Container Corporation was formed with 2 ideas, that it will have the export-import exempt traffic in containers, and it will also bring back the domestic traffic which we have lost to the running of block rakes, the piecemeal traffic which we have lost. That has not materialized. Somebody should go into it very deep. That needs a study. I think that roll-on, roll-off of trucks on the wagons probably is a very good exercise, should be undertaken. I had a meeting with him last to the management of change. The railway is not changing, it is not reforming. That is a problem. The largest organization, 1.3 million employees, one of the largest holder of Group A services, 8 Group A services in one ministry. No other ministry has like that. UPSC recruited Group A services, 8 of them in railways. Inter-C seniority is a problem. There are silos. How to break it? I thought that we have ministers and all this time the government should be able to do it, and it has not happened. Someday it will happen. Again, it needs a lot of political force. It needs a good insight and vision. Should be done. We are already suffering because of reforms in the railway structure not taking place. China has already done it twice in the last 20 years. And we have been talking about it for more than 30 years and not doing anything. So I hope that it will be done one day. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Unless there's Rakesh, any burning remarks or last sort of...
Only that I hope that Mr. Sahai remarks that maybe something will happen in the future do fructify. But I'm actually staggered myself that it's 20 years now since we made these kind of recommendations. And as you said, during this period, China has done all these reforms. So in fact, if I'm not mistaken, there's no railways ministry now.
Transport ministry.
There's a transport ministry. They used to have railways ministry. They've abolished it. Russia used to have railways ministry. They've abolished it. Somehow we are the only holdout among any major railways which refuses to reform. And I don't agree with Mr. Sahai that it's the politicians, it's the railways senior staff who does not want change at any given time except for Mr. Sahai when he was chairman.
Thank you, Rakesh, Mr. Sahai, Mr. Bajwa, and thank you everyone for joining us for very lively discussions, which I hope can continue with refreshments. Please join us outside. Thank you, everyone.